In May of 1972, formal talks will begin in Paris, known as the Paris Peace Talks, that will ultimately bring an end to the Vietnam War for the United States. This is not to be confused with the Paris Peace Conference. If you hear the Paris Peace Conference, we're talking the post-World War I negotiations to come to a treaty. This is the Paris Peace Talks of 1972, so it's dealing with Vietnam. Henry Kissinger, and he's seen right here. Henry Kissinger is the lead negotiator for the United States. And he is working out an agreement to end this war with North Vietnam. And North Vietnam wants the same thing. They want the war to end as well, but they want favorable terms for themselves. Neither side is really willing to compromise on some important aspects. For example, the North, in their negotiations, they want representation in the South's government. Now, that would make the United States and certainly South Vietnam a little nervous, right? Because we have seen examples in the early Cold War of communists in governments that proclaim themselves to be democratic, and they would ultimately push out the non-communist members. Remember, we talked about the salami tactics of the post-World War II years. So the North wanted representation in some government, in the government of the South. And the battlefield is still active. All right, there are still American troops in the South. ARVN troops are doing more. There's still North Vietnamese army in the South. Viet Cong are still active. And beginning in May of 1972, while these talks have started, the United States will begin one of the largest bombing campaigns, certainly of the entire Vietnam War, but actually of the 20th century, known as Operation Linebacker. This is actually Linebacker 1. There's going to be two Operation Linebackers. Operation Linebacker 1 is from May to October of 1972. And it's going to be the first continuous bombing campaign of North Vietnam since Operation Rolling Thunder ended back in 1968. Now, the hope here is that the United States, through this massive bombing campaign of Linebacker, can convince the North to negotiate on favorable terms to the Americans. Like, hey, look what we can do now. We are also entering into a time period in 1972 within the Cold War story called détente. And we will talk more about détente at a later date. I think there's one of those in there. Détente refers to an easing of tensions in the Cold War. So the détente period of the Cold War is the early 1970s, when the United States was trying to form better relationships with both China and the Soviet Union, but especially China. We'll talk more about this at a later date, but President Nixon is actually going to be the first American president to go to Beijing and meet with Mao Zedong, trying to form better relations. And one way to have better relations with China and to have better relations with the Soviet Union during this détente period is getting out of the war in Vietnam. That is like the greatest irritant to good relations between China and the United States. So our détente with the Soviet Union and China is also helping us to get out of this conflict in Vietnam. Like, because if we can have good relations with the Chinese, if we can have good relations with the Soviets, they might convince North Vietnam to really seriously negotiate. Because remember, who is arming the North Vietnamese? It's the Chinese and the Soviets. In November of 1972, there is another presidential election coming around. Okay, it seems like these happen quite often. It's every 4 years, but it goes fast in the history class. In November of 1972, there's another presidential election. Richard Nixon is running for re-election. All the while, during this campaign, Henry Kissinger is in Paris negotiating for an end to this war. On October 31st, easy to remember, it's Halloween. On October 31st, 1972, President Kissinger will publicly announce, so this will be reported in the American media, he will publicly announce October 31st, 1972, 1 week before the election, Kissinger will publicly announce that peace is at hand in Vietnam. That we have an agreement. Peace is at hand in Vietnam. It kind of reminds you possibly of General Westmoreland saying in 1967, in December of 67, that we see the light at the end of the tunnel, that we're almost through this war. Well, now, 1 week before the presidential election, Kissinger supporting a Nixon who ran his first campaign promising to get out of the war, and yet we're still in the war. 1 week before the next election, his re-election campaign, Henry Kissinger, our chief negotiator, says publicly, peace is at hand. Though peace wasn't at hand. The North Vietnamese thought peace was at hand. The Americans thought we had an agreement. But who doesn't want to sign the dotted line? South Vietnam. I said in the beginning, they were the biggest impediment. South Vietnam in these negotiations was the biggest impediment to an agreement. Because what does South Vietnam know? And remember, we know what happens because we know what happens. South Vietnam doesn't know what happens, but they know what's going to happen, if you know what I mean. What does South Vietnam know is going to happen if there's a negotiated end to this conflict? Americans will do what? Leave. Americans will leave, and they believe that eventually North Vietnam will violate that agreement, and it will mean the end of the government of South Vietnam. And they're absolutely right. But we don't know they're right because it hasn't happened yet. So Kissinger says a week before the presidential election, peace is at hand. But peace wasn't really at hand because there's three parties at play here. North Vietnam, the United States, and South Vietnam. And South Vietnam is not ready to sign this agreement. Of course, the election comes. Of course, Nixon wins re-election. There's more to that story. We'll talk about that in a moment. In order to convince South Vietnam to agree to this October agreement of the Paris peace talks, the United States will usher in another round of bombing campaign called Linebacker 2, also known as the Christmas bombings, because this happened over the Christmas time in 1972. So here we go. We said peace was at hand. Can you imagine what the American populace must be thinking after having re-elected Richard Nixon and now another massive bombing campaign of the North? Linebacker 2 was done to convince the South that, hey, America is never going to leave you. We are here. Look what we can do to support you. And if this treaty is not obligated by the North, we will come back. We promise the South that we will be there to support them. In Linebacker 2, we even bombed Hanoi, a city that has long been left off targets, to persuade the South Vietnamese leader, a guy named Thieu, Thieu, and I apologize for butchering his name. We want to persuade him to sign that agreement. The United States is going to assure the government of South Vietnam that we would respond with military force if this agreement is violated. In January of 1973, January 27th of 1973, a settlement is finally agreed to. What comes out of the Paris peace talks are known as the Paris Peace Accords. Not to be confused with the Geneva Accords that ended the war with France. This is the Paris Peace Accords. And here's what is agreed to in January of 1973. All American troops are to leave Vietnam. And both North and South Vietnam, the governments of North Vietnam, the governments of South Vietnam, would respect a dividing line in Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Not to be confused with the 38th parallel up in Korea. Vietnam's much further to the south. What's that?
Isn't the Vietnamese DMZ approximately the same point that the two borders were?
Yeah, pretty much the identical point to the original division, yes. Also, American prisoners of war, of which there were many from all of those airplanes that anti-aircraft fire in the north had shot down over the previous 10 years of the war. American prisoners of war would be released.
Never happened.
Did happen.
Not all of them.
The last troops would withdraw within 2 weeks of signing the agreement. So North Vietnamese troops would withdraw from South Vietnam.
That would probably have been hard logistically for them, considering the difficulty with communication.
Could be. So the last troops from North Vietnam were to withdraw within 2 weeks of signing the agreement. The South Vietnamese government is not happy with this agreement. But they only signed the treaty because Nixon, through Kissinger, basically said, we are going to sign it with or without you. So you need, basically, we are going regardless of you signing this or not. This is going to come to an end. So save some face and sign it, and we will be back if this is violated. So in January of 1973, the Paris Peace Accords are signed, and the Vietnam War for the United States comes to an end. In the aftermath, within 2 years, North Vietnam's army violates the Paris Peace Accords. They invade across that 17th parallel. The United States does not offer any help, and we'll talk about why in a moment. The United States, despite pleas from the South, does not offer any help. And in April of 1945, the city of Saigon will fall. April of 1975, thank you, keeping you honest. In April of 1975, the capital city of South Vietnam, Saigon, falls. And here's an infamous photo of embassy workers escaping from the American embassy as it was about to be overrun via helicopter to flee South Vietnam. Despite South Vietnam's pleas for help, the United States would offer none. And here we have a little side story. The 1972 presidential election is the election that featured the Watergate scandal. The Watergate scandal is the presidential scandal that ended up putting the suffix G-A-T-E, gate, on every other scandal that would ever occur in American history. Except they're not calling this thing in Flint Watergate, because that would maybe be confusing, but that would be probably the most perfect use of that suffix. But even Tom Brady possibly tinkering with footballs became Deflategate. The original gate scandal was Watergate. Watergate was a hotel complex in Washington, D.C., all right? Today, I think they're condos. So the Watergate Hotel in the presidential election of 1972 is where the Democratic National Committee had their headquarters. So they just rented out a bunch of rooms in the Watergate Hotel, and that is where they ran their presidential headquarters out of. In the lead up to the election of 1972, there was a break-in in the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. Fortunately, Forrest Gump was staying right across the way, and he was able to see something going on, and he alerted authorities to it. That's not real, but it made for a funny part of the movie. The Watergate break-in eventually was investigated, and there were reporters that got on the case. The famous Woodward and Bernstein, if you've heard those names, you don't need to worry about it for our class. Reporters got on the case, and as they started scratching the surface of this case, it made it higher and higher and higher and higher up the administration of President Nixon, ultimately implicating Nixon himself with knowledge of this break-in. President Nixon would resign in disgrace in 1974. President Nixon would resign in disgrace in 1974. He resigned. He became the only American president to ever resign his office, to ever quit, and what's that? 1974, yeah. He resigned because he would have been impeached. And had he been impeached, he would have been the first American president to ever be removed from office through an impeachment trial. We've had a couple other presidents impeached, but no one's ever been removed. President Nixon resigned before any of that could happen. Because Nixon is now gone, his vice president, Gerald Ford, becomes the new president. Gerald Ford is in a really interesting and horrible position.
He was never elected.
Gerald Ford not only was never elected to be president, but he was also not elected to be vice president. Because before the Watergate scandal completely blew up, Richard Nixon's vice president, a guy named Spiro Agnew, don't worry about this. Spiro Agnew resigned himself. So Gerald Ford was basically appointed to be vice president and then appointed to be president. By most accounts, Gerald Ford is probably one of the nicest, best people to ever be president of the United States. But there was nobody that had beef with Gerald Ford. A good guy. And he was kind of from Michigan, so we liked that. And he went to U of M. And he was a all-American football player. And there's a lot of great things about Gerald Ford. But Gerald Ford was put in a horrible position. He was made president of the United States because of the U.S. Constitution. He was made president of the United States, but he has absolutely no popular political support. So when Gerald Ford makes a plea to the American Congress to support the defense of South Vietnam as they're begging for help when North Vietnam invades the South, when Gerald Ford makes a plea to the American Congress, the American Congress says, President, we did this 10 years ago. In 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. We're not going to do it again. And we don't have to support you because, yeah, you're the President of the United States, but you're not going to be around for long. Because we know what everybody knows. In the 1976 presidential election that's going to be right around the corner, there is no way you or any Republican can win that election. The Democrats can put anybody against you, even Jimmy Carter, and they're going to win. And that ultimately is going to be what happens. So Ford makes an impassioned plea to Congress to support South Vietnam. Congress isn't touching Gerald Ford with a 10-foot pole. They're not touching Vietnam anymore either. Because what does every congressman have to think about?
Getting reelected.
Their own re-elections.
Because they don't have term limits.
And now it is not popularly supported to support the government of South Vietnam. So we don't support South Vietnam. South Vietnam falls. Exactly what President Thieu of South Vietnam thought was going to happen. That ultimately happened. What are the costs of this war? Immeasurable. Shortly after the war, Cambodia and Laos, next door to Vietnam, would also fall to communism. So we had the start of that domino theory that we were long afraid of. Laos in the north, Cambodia in the south. They would also become communist states. But the domino theory would stop there. It wouldn't push further into Thailand or Burma or anywhere else. Countless deaths. It's estimated at over 1 million communist military deaths from 1954 to 1975. So that's Viet Cong, that's North Vietnamese regulars. Possibly over 2 million civilian casualties in this war. It wouldn't surprise you to hear that the United States estimates of that figure are far lower.
Well, and those are still constantly rising because, say, landmines.
Yeah, sure.
Unexploded ordnance.
South Vietnamese military deaths over 100. Yes, ma'am. No, go ahead. Yeah. So you've got 1 million North Vietnamese and communist troops. South Vietnamese deaths number over 100,000 in terms of their military, the ARVN troops, 100,000. When I said 2 million civilian deaths, I hope I said casualties. Did I say casualties or deaths?
Yeah.
Thank you. I think I said casualties. 2 million civilian casualties. That's deaths, injuries, and things like that. Over 400,000 civilian deaths in the country. And the American Army suffered 58,000 dead. So in terms of human lives, and then in terms of the costs of the war financially, this was a massive, massive war. Now, in comparing it to something like the Second World War, small potatoes compared to that. But certainly for the people of Vietnam, this war could not have been any bigger. Impact on the United States. One second. Impact on the United States. American troops would come home at the end of this war to little fanfare. There's going to be no ticker tape parades or anything like that happening like we saw at the end of the Second World War. Because the United States didn't really seem like it came home with much of a victory in early 1973 when our troops finally came home. We were there for 10 years, and in the end, what were we left with? A picture of Vietnam that looked exactly the same as it did in 1964. So it didn't seem like we really won very much. And then, of course, by 1975, when South Vietnam falls, now it looks like those 58,000 American dead were all in vain. America also has questions about what to do with the thousands of draft dodgers. Many young men who, to avoid service in Vietnam, avoided that draft. Some of them fled to Canada, got out of the United States because they violated American law. Some in the American government called for a blanket amnesty. You guys might have heard this word amnesty thrown around a lot in the last couple years with regard to immigration. Amnesty, quiet, Donnie. Amnesty refers to like just saying you're free, you're absolved of any wrongdoing. All right? Okay? In modern days, the idea of amnesty to illegal immigrants is the position that says, hey, yes, they violated American law by coming into the United States and living here illegally, but what are we going to do? Can't get rid of 11 million people, so let's just have a blanket amnesty. Some politicians are supportive of that notion. After Vietnam, there was some support for amnesty of draft dodgers. Let these guys come home and live their lives, not as possible criminals in the United States. This also gained support when President Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. One presidential power that you guys are going to hear a lot about in the next few weeks, or pardon me, next few months, because it's in Obama's last year. One presidential power afforded to him by the Constitution is the ability to pardon criminals of wrongdoing in federal crimes. So if you have broken the law, it is a federal law, and you are serving time for it, or you could possibly one day serve time for it, the president can pardon you. Every president pardons a bunch of people in their last days of office. It's just something they do. As they're heading out the door, they pardon a bunch of people. It's very controversial because sometimes people they've pardoned are people whose families might have donated some money or something like this. It happens, so every president does it. President Ford is going to use his presidential pardon power to pardon Richard Nixon of any criminal wrongdoing. He does it not because he doesn't think Richard Nixon did anything wrong. He does it because he doesn't think it would be good for the United States to have a president of the United States, a former president of the United States, put on a criminal trial and possibly serve criminal jail time. Because guys did go to jail for the Watergate scandal. So Ford pardoned Nixon. A lot of people had some serious problems with this because Nixon is pretty much the least popular guy in America at this point. How can you pardon the president from wrongdoing and yet still hold all of these Americans accountable for wrongdoing they did in protesting of a war that many by 1975 are seeing as a bad war that maybe shouldn't have been fought? Ultimately, President Jimmy Carter is going to win that 1976 presidential election. And he will be the guy to offer that blanket amnesty for draft dodgers, hoping to mend the wounds that the Vietnam War had caused. The impact of this war on Vietnam is even greater. Integrating North Vietnam and South Vietnam proved very difficult. Cities across the country, but especially in the South, would be flooded with refugees, as most of the bombing occurred in the countryside. But there would be no communist bloodbath. The fears that some in the American media and the government had, that if the communists took over the South, there would be a massive massacre in South Vietnam. That never happened in South Vietnam. Some that were connected to government officials, though, there were some beatings. There were some people that ended up not being around anymore. But there was not any massive bloodshed across the countryside. You would see that next door in Cambodia. Yes, ma'am? You have a question?
What year was Jimmy Carter?
1976, he was elected, so he became president in 1977. You would see that in Cambodia. When a communist regime took over Cambodia, you would see a massive bloodbath with over 1 million killed. And sometimes it was as easy to find who would be targeted as just looking if they wore glasses. So I would be gone, and you would be gone, and you would be gone, because we would be seen as an intellectual class that was not desired as worth keeping around in Cambodia. That didn't happen in South Vietnam. There were re-education camps in the South that the new government instituted, where citizens of the South had to now go to camps to, quote, learn how to live in this new communist society. The government attempted to force collectivization throughout the country. So individuals that owned their own land for years would now lose that as collectivization would enter. And Vietnam would spend most of the next 20 years being one of the poorest nations in the world. Modern economic reforms in Vietnam, similar to what China has done in the last 30 years, have helped Vietnam reestablish an economic footing. It's not completely a communist country anymore, especially economically speaking. It is still a communist one-party state. But economically, there's been massive foreign investment from multinational corporations in Vietnam that have helped Vietnam have a pretty strong growing economy in recent years. Questions, comments, concerns?